And any preacher that puts a white Jesus in that church is a preacher that is already heading you to hell. Because he's disobeying the fundamental law that says, thou shalt not build unto me any graven images. And God knows that when you start projecting images in terms of ethnic groups, it has a psychology about it that creates inferiority and self-hatred, and it makes those who are not a part of that ethnic group believe that that ethnic group is somehow divinely blessed and is godlike in its aspect. And many blacks believe in their heart of hearts that the white man is divine in some sort of way. That he has been divinely destined to rule over black people. Well, this is his world and we may as well adjust in it. Well, you know, so we accommodate this white man because the white man has usurped the image of divinity. And yet those of you who've read Ben Yochanan, those of you who've read the other black historians and read the true history of black, know, if you want to play this partisan game, this ethnic game, that the premier symbol of divinity was blackness. And therefore, the white man had to usurp that image and steal the image of divinity from black people. And there are many whites today who've stolen the image of divinity and the image of religion and so forth from black people. And the black people who do not know themselves then will be victimized by this usurpation and thievery. And we see it again happening in this particular instance.
What I would see is an overemphasis on European scholars or European authors, you know, the Shakespeare, the Chaucers, to the relative neglect of people of African descent, writers and scholars and people too, who have done work that should be emulated by black people. Also, not intentional, I would think, on her part, but perhaps inadvertently the belief that one can achieve intellectual functioning only by the assimilation of European ideas, and that the assimilation of European literature is the base for which one must build higher intellectual functioning. I'm afraid that what you will have is what we have now in too many instances, if you follow the logical progression of what's happening here in that situation, of students who will be functioning on a very high intellectual level, but who in a practical sense will be of little value to the black community, because their orientations, their tastes and values will essentially be European, and therefore the work that they do will essentially support the European structure and help to maintain European dominance. To a great extent, this is what you have going on in America today. The vast majority, or at least a large percentage of black children are kicked out of the system because they don't assimilate the European philosophy. Those few blacks that are let through at the price of alienating themselves from blackness and from afrocentric ideas. So you have a situation here where you may get more black MBAs, Masters of Business Administration, okay, more blacks who are economics majors, and yet you see the black communities crumbling economically. You get, for instance, you get more black psychologists, and yet you don't see any visible or any demonstrable effect of those blacks in a positive sense on the black community as such. It appears then, even though we are educating so-called more blacks, its effects in a positive way on the black community has been negligible. And I think this is in part due to the fact that blacks are Europeanized and therefore not trained to think in terms of how their knowledge and information relates to
let me ask you this.
The advancement of black people.
Down to solutions. What do you have to do to begin to get a black child to think from an Afrocentric perspective?
Well, certainly we would like to have the parent, him or herself, or both of them obviously, to have what we call the Afrocentric view, and that is a black parent who is familiar with African history and African culture, and who has what we call the goal in mind of advancing the interests of black people in terms of themselves, not just in terms of other people as such. I think that is a prerequisite. Certainly the home environment becomes of key importance here in developing this Afrocentric view and of emerging the child in things African. I'm not necessarily one who advocates the preaching of Africanness at children, because quite often it may reverse the very process that you want to bring about as such. But a sort of subtle emergence of the child into the ways of African culture, such as taking them to events that are African-oriented, and of course filling the house, if possible, with books that have the African orientation as such, or sometimes critiquing the obvious control mechanisms that are apparent, say, in TV when the child is sitting there looking at it, and to a degree sometimes even shielding the child from programs such as the different strokes programs and things of this nature, so that they will not be insidiously.
What do you think about that program?
I try not to, to tell you the truth.
What would you just for us today?
Yes, I think it's a bit, it's a dangerous kind of program, frankly, to be honest with you. Different strokes. Because, again, it's a program where the paternalism of whites is built in. And almost the idea that whites somehow can provide a much better paternalistic environment than blacks. By implication, there is the idea that blacks don't care enough about these kids to have adopted them themselves or to have taken care of them, or the black family network could not, that those relatives, let us say, of those kids would not have taken those children into being. But the main thing, it internalizes this concept of the white man as a problem solver for black people. As a man, even in a benevolent way, is going to take care.
The white shadow.
The white shadow is another instance. Here again is the great problem solver. And to a great extent, the problem of our people is the white shadow. By that I mean where quite often we as people are unable to see each other as real, because we more or less look at each other through the spectacles that the white shadow has placed on us. And a lot of what we call the so-called lack of unity or struggle that goes on within the black community is built on false issues that has been handed to us by the establishment as such through these kinds of programs. In African perspective, not only as something you go back to in terms of roots, but as something to be developed as well by African people, you see. Because certainly, as wonderful as our historical past is, we certainly have to adjust to the stresses and strains of the modern day world. But that must be developed not as a hand-me-down philosophy, but as one developed out of our own experience as a people and our own economic and social situation in the world. And it's based upon a cultural, social, political analysis of where we are now, with a deliberate and conscious setting up a program for the kind of culture that we want to develop. So that would be as African or Afrocentric as the past ones were Afrocentric, say, before the periods of colonialism. That is going to offend people. And
when the Italian speaks of being Italian, well, what is the difference? It seems to be, some people say, it seems to be okay. But when the black man speaks about being black, it's somehow...
Certainly, I think the black man speaking of being black is certainly more threatening than, say, the Italian speaking as Italian or French as a Frenchman, because, in a sense, the Frenchman is still European in that sense, and is talking about it within that structure as such. But when you're talking about, and of course whether it's Italian or French or what have you, are still part and parcel of the benefits that European culture as a whole gains from maintaining the subjugation of our people. But when you talk about an African as an African, the implications are that they will no longer be able to exploit us as a people. That's threatening, of course, because their economic and social order is based upon our exploitation. And therefore, in a very human sense, certainly it should arouse anxiety and fear to a good extent when you hear this kind of talk. The black nationalist is frightening because in many ways, he in another way is very much like the white man who is nationalistic and who's very much concerned about maintaining his group. And he knows that that involves maintaining power as such. And so therefore, when another people begin talking about maintaining their group and building up their group, it means that that power has got to be redistributed, and as well as the economics and social benefits that go with it. As long as a black, though, indicates that he wants to be American, or he wants to be integrated into America, then that is less threatening because it indicates that he is basically going to support the system, and he's therefore not a threat to the system as such. As a result, you see, of the control and the paternalism of Europeans over black people, you see, the other thing that we must recognize, even if the European becomes good and nice and accepts us and so forth, the fact that he would still be in control creates what we might call a benevolent paternalism, which still to a degree helps to maintain this passive mode of thinking, this passive mode of knowledge. Now, when you get into the classroom, you see a child then that wants to be told what the answers are instead of how the answer can be attained. For instance, sometimes in my class, I give an exam, and we're looking at the results of the exam. And the first question you would get sometimes is, well, what is the answer to so-and-so and so-and-so? And I had to say, look, you must find that answer yourself and dig it up. The emphasis is quite often then on memorizing the answer. So therefore, reasoning as a tool for finding the answer is thrown out as such. And the child then is handicapped in that if he has not memorized the answer, then he fails the exam because he either knows the answer or does not know the answer. You get what we call one-shot thinking. You say, I'll shoot and guess at the answer. Quite often, it gets into a kind of thinking that depends upon personal feelings. Often I find in my classroom, which is predominantly black, sometimes that I have to get the students to separate personal feelings and hunches from dealing with a problem as a problem that is susceptible to reason, not as a problem that has an emotional attachment to it as such. But you see, when you remove reason and sequential thinking and active attacking of a problem as the mode of approach, then the person is thrown back on memorizing, on guessing, on going with impulses, and on being unsystematic in their approach to knowledge, upon waiting for someone else to give the answer. So what you see quite often with the black child in the classroom is somewhat of a miniature reflection of the orientation of black adults to white people. For instance, to a great extent, black people look at Reagan as some kind of white daddy, and we see this kind of business, please, in the sense, Daddy Reagan, don't do this, or are we waiting for Daddy Kennedy to come back into the White House? And rarely do we hear a discussion about what are we as black adults going to do to solve our problem. You see, this is communicated to our children, and it's communicated in a way that they too wait for the answer. Blacks think that we've been misled by our leadership, for instance. They think that we can consume our way into equality and sees equality as an equality of materials. So if I have the same car as a white person, if I have the same house as a white person, a similar job, then I'm equal. But you cannot consume yourself into equality. You must produce yourself into equality. And you move into equality and beyond by productive thinking. Because as long as you're consuming knowledge or you're consuming materials, the guy who is giving it to you or selling it to you is producing at the same time, which means that you never catch up with him because he's always 2 or 3 steps ahead of you. To a good extent, many of our students go into schools, college as well as secondary levels, consuming, and their minds are not being developed to produce the true means by which they will accomplish equality. Everything else is sham.